If you have hooded eyes, you've probably heard a dozen explanations for where they came from: aging, genetics, ethnicity, bad luck. But almost none of those explanations tell the real story, because the real story starts tens of thousands of years before you were born, written into a gene most people have never heard of. For most of human history, nobody thought much about eyelids at all. They were just there, quietly doing their job, blinking, protecting, and closing each night without ceremony, without anyone giving them a second glance. Nobody imagined that the fold of skin sitting above someone's eye could carry within it a signature of ancient migration, climate pressure, and evolutionary survival. But that is exactly what modern genetics has started to reveal. And once you understand it, you will never look at a mirror the same way again. Let's start with what hooded eyes actually are, because the term gets used loosely, and that looseness has caused a lot of confusion online. A hooded eye is one where a fold of skin, usually originating from the brow area, drapes down over the visible crease of the upper eyelid. Instead of a clean, open lid line, the crease is partially or fully obscured, sometimes only appearing when the eyebrow is lifted. It can make eyes look smaller, more shadowed, or more mysterious, depending on how you want to describe it. This is different, technically, from what is called an epicanthic fold, which is a fold of skin specifically at the inner corner of the eye, near the nose, most commonly associated with East Asian, Central Asian, Southeast Asian, Polynesian, and indigenous American populations, though it appears at lower frequencies almost everywhere else in the world too. The two features are related in the public imagination, and they do sometimes overlap in appearance, but they are governed by overlapping yet distinct sets of anatomical structures. Understanding that distinction matters because when scientists went looking for the DNA behind these features, they had to separate two different questions: what makes the upper lid skin fold and drape the way it does, and what makes the inner corner of the eye look the way it does? The answers to both questions turned out to be layered, complicated, and far more interesting than a single gene switching on or off. Here is the first thing that surprised researchers. There's no such thing as a single hooded eye gene. If you were expecting one clean answer, one tidy DNA marker that explains everything, science is going to disappoint you in the best possible way, because the truth is more fascinating than that. Eyelid structure is what geneticists call a polygenic trait. That means it is shaped by the combined cumulative influence of many different genes working together, each contributing a small effect on its own, but producing a dramatic result when they combine. Some of these genes influence how much collagen your skin produces. Others influence how fat is distributed around your eye socket. Still others shape the underlying bone structure of your skull, the height of your brow ridge, and the depth of your eye socket itself. Even the shape of your nasal bridge plays an indirect role because facial structures do not develop in isolation. They develop as an interconnected system, where a change in one area can subtly reshape the appearance of another. This is part of why hooded eyes can vary so much even within the same family. Two siblings can inherit different combinations of these gene variants from their parents, producing eyelids that look noticeably different from one another, even though they come from the same genetic pool. It also explains why the trait can skip a generation, intensify in a grandchild, or appear in a milder form in one sibling compared to another. You are not looking at a simple coin flip of inheritance. You are looking at the layered outcome of dozens of genetic dials, each turned slightly differently in every individual. So if there is no single gene, what have scientists actually found? This is where things get specific. Researchers, using genome-wide association studies, often shortened to GWAS, have scanned the human genome looking for patterns, searching for locations in our DNA that correlate with facial features, including the structure of the eyelid. These studies are enormously powerful because they compare the genetic code of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people, looking for tiny variations that show up more often in individuals with a particular trait. Specific studies targeting hooded eyelids as their own category are still limited, which is part of why misinformation spreads so easily on this topic. But research into closely related traits like ptosis, which is the drooping of the eyelid margin due to muscle weakness, and dermatochalasis, which is the loss of skin elasticity that leads to excess sagging skin, has given scientists valuable clues. Several candidate genes have emerged from this research. One of them is PAX6, a gene that plays a critical role in early eye development in the womb. PAX6 is best known for its involvement in serious developmental conditions, when it mutates strongly, but subtler variations in genes connected to this pathway may influence the more cosmetic, everyday differences in eyelid shape that we see across the population. Then there are the MMP genes, short for matrix metalloproteinases, which are involved in breaking down and remodeling collagen. Since collagen is one of the primary structural proteins that gives skin its firmness and elasticity, variants in these genes may directly influence how much skin sags or folds around the eye over a lifetime. Genes connected to the TGF-beta signaling pathway are also in the picture, because this pathway governs how connective tissue is built and repaired throughout the body. including the delicate tissue around the eyelid. And finally, there is LAMA1, a gene linked to the integrity of basement membranes, the microscopic scaffolding that holds layers of tissue together. Subtle differences in LAMA1 may contribute in small ways to how the eyelid holds its structural form over time. None of these genes act alone. None of them are the single cause. But together, in combination, they form a genetic architecture that shapes something as visually distinct as whether your eyelid crease shows clearly or disappears beneath a soft fold of skin. Now here's where the story turns, from modern laboratory genetics into something closer to ancient history, and this is the part that connects most directly to that phrase you may have heard, that hooded eyes and related eye shapes trace back more than 30,000 years. This part of the story does not center on hooded eyes exactly, but on a closely related feature, the epicanthic fold, and the gene most strongly implicated in its spread across human populations. That gene is called EDAR, short for the ectodisplastin receptor gene. In 2013, a team of researchers led by scientist Yana Kambarov published a landmark study in the journal Cell that changed how scientists understood this piece of human history. They focused on a specific variant of the EDAR gene, known by its technical name EDAR 370A. This variant is remarkable for a reason that goes beyond eye shape alone. Genome-wide scans of human DNA have repeatedly flagged EDAR 370A as one of the strongest signals of recent positive selection found anywhere in the human genome. Positive selection is the scientific term for a trait that spread rapidly through a population because it provided some kind of survival or reproductive advantage, strong enough that natural selection actively favored individuals who carried it. Finding a signal this strong is rare. It tells scientists that something about this particular genetic variant gave real, measurable benefits to the people who carried it, benefits significant enough to reshape the genetic makeup of an entire regional population over time. To understand what EDR 370A actually does, and how confident scientists are about its effects, Kambarov's team did something clever. Rather than relying only on statistical correlations in human population data, they engineered mice to carry the human version of this variant, allowing them to directly observe its biological effects in a living organism. What they found was striking. The variant influenced multiple traits at once, not just one. It affected hair thickness, producing coarser, denser hair strands. It affected the number of sweat glands, increasing their density in the skin. It affected tooth shape, contributing to what is known as shovel-shaped incisors, a distinctive dental trait common in East Asian and indigenous American populations. And critically, the researchers found that this same genetic pathway also influenced how fat is distributed around the eye and how the eyelid forms during development, contributing indirectly to the appearance of the epicanthic fold. Using computational modeling based on patterns of genetic variation still present in modern populations, the research team estimated that this variant first arose in central China, and that it began spreading and increasing in frequency approximately 30,000 years ago. That number is the origin of the timeline you may have seen referenced in videos and articles claiming that hooded eyes, broadly speaking, trace back tens of thousands of years. The science behind that number is real, and it comes from serious, peer-reviewed research. But it is important to understand exactly what that number refers to. It refers to the estimated age and geographic origin of a genetic variant connected to a cluster of traits, including hair texture, sweat gland density, tooth shape, and eyelid fat distribution, not to a single confirmed hooded eye gene with no other complicating variables. This is where the story gets even more interesting because science rarely stays simple for long, and the full picture is more nuanced than a single clean narrative about one ancient mutation explaining everything. More recent genome-wide association studies have specifically searched for DNA variants linked to the epicanthic fold itself, separate from the other traits connected to EDR 370A. Researchers have genotyped large cohorts, including groups of Han Chinese participants specifically looking for genetic signatures tied to eyelid folding. What they found complicates the tidy narrative. Unlike the extremely strong selection signal seen for EDR 370A's effects on hair and sweat glands, these more targeted studies have not detected the same kind of strong positive selection signature specifically for the epicanthic fold trait itself. This has led some researchers to propose a different explanation, one rooted not in active selection, but in something called genetic drift. Genetic drift refers to random fluctuations in how common a gene variant becomes in a population. Fluctuations that happen simply by chance rather than because the trait offers any particular survival advantage. One proposed mechanism involves population bottlenecks, moments in history when a group of people becomes small and isolated, perhaps due to migration into a new and challenging environment. When a population goes through a bottleneck like this, certain gene variants can become fixed, meaning they spread to nearly everyone in that smaller group, purely due to chance and the reduced genetic diversity of a small founding population, not because the trait was specifically advantageous. Ancestral populations moving through Siberia and Northeast Asia during the depths of the Ice Age may have experienced exactly this kind of bottleneck. And if epicanthic fold variants happened to be present at higher frequencies among the survivors of that bottleneck, the trait could have spread to high frequency in their descendants through drift alone, independent of whether it provided any specific functional benefit. This does not mean the trait definitely has no adaptive value. It means that the genetic evidence for direct selection on the epicanthic fold specifically is weaker and murkier than the evidence for selection on some of EDAR 7-Day's other, more strongly selected effects, like hair thickness and sweat-gland density. Naturally, this raises the question that has fascinated anthropologists and evolutionary biologists for decades. If there was some adaptive advantage, what exactly was it? The most widely repeated theory centers on cold climate protection. According to this idea, as early human populations migrated northward into the frigid, wind-battered landscapes of Siberia and Central Asia, additional fat padding around the eyes and a narrower eye opening created by the epicanthic fold may have offered real physical protection. A narrower eye slit reduces the surface area exposed to bitter wind and extreme cold, potentially reducing the risk of frostbite to delicate eye tissue. There is also a related theory involving light exposure, sometimes called the snow blindness hypothesis. In open, snow-covered landscapes, sunlight reflecting off snow and ice can be extraordinarily intense, capable of causing a painful and damaging condition called photokeratitis, essentially a sunburn of the eye's surface. A narrower eye opening, shaped in part by the epicanthic fold, would reduce the amount of light entering the eye, functioning almost like a built-in pair of sunglasses, offering some protection against this kind of glare-related eye damage during long exposure to bright, snow-reflected sunlight. A third theory focuses on dry, dusty environments, like the vast open steppes and deserts of Central Asia. In these harsh, arid conditions, the fold may have acted as a physical barrier, helping to keep windborne dust and sand out of the eyes, while also helping to retain moisture in an environment where dehydration was a constant threat. These theories are compelling and they make intuitive sense, but they are not universally accepted, and serious critics have pushed back hard against treating any of them as a settled, complete explanation. One of the most pointed criticisms comes from looking beyond East Asia entirely. The epicanthic fold and related eye shapes are not exclusive to populations with a history of Ice Age cold climates. They also appear among certain indigenous groups in southern Africa, including the Khoisan peoples, who are native to regions of South Africa that have nothing resembling the frozen, snow-covered landscapes central to the cold adaptation theory. These populations have tightly coiled hair, golden brown skin tones, prominent cheekbones, and eye folds that create a visibly similar slanted appearance to the folds seen in some Asian populations, all without any connection to extreme cold or snow glare in their ancestral environment. Critics argue that this kind of cross-continental appearance of the trait in wildly different climates undermines the idea that cold weather alone can fully explain why the trait exists and persists. It suggests the true evolutionary story might be more complicated, involving some combination of ancient shared ancestry, independent development in different populations, genetic drift, and possibly multiple different adaptive pressures acting in different regions at different points in deep human history, rather than one single climate-driven cause applying everywhere the trait shows up. What all of this means is that the honest scientific answer to where hooded eyes and related eye shapes really come from is not a single simple story, but a layered one, built from multiple overlapping threads of evidence. There's the polygenic architecture of eyelid structure itself, involving dozens of genes tied to collagen, fat distribution, connective tissue, and bone shape, none of which act alone. There is the specific, well-documented history of the EDAR R370A variant, arising roughly 30,000 years ago in central China, spreading through a population under conditions of strong positive selection, and influencing a cluster of traits including hair texture, sweat gland density, tooth shape, and fat distribution around the eyes. There is the separate, murkier question of whether the epicanthic fold itself was directly selected for, or whether it spread more through the random effects of population bottlenecks and genetic drift during ancient migrations through Siberia and Northeast Asia. And there is the ongoing scientific debate over whether cold protection, snow glare reduction, dust protection, or some combination of forces, or perhaps none of them in a purely adaptive sense, best explains why these features persist and vary the way they do across human populations today. It is also worth pausing to appreciate just how widely distributed hooded eyes are across humanity, because this trait is often mistakenly treated as though it belongs to one group alone, when the reality is far more universal. Hooded eyes appear across every race and ethnicity on the planet, though the frequency and typical presentation differ from population to population. People of East Asian, Southeast Asian, Polynesian, and Native American descent show some of the highest documented rates of hooded and epicanthic eye features, closely tied to the ancient genetic history connected to EDAR 370A, and it's spread through ancestral East Asian and Siberian populations. But hooded eyes are also extremely common among people of Northern and Eastern European descent, particularly those with Scandinavian, British, German, and Slavic ancestry. In these populations, hooded eyes typically arise through a somewhat different combination of factors, often connected to a naturally heavier brow bone structure and thicker eyelid skin present from a young age, inherited independently through the broader polygenic system of facial development genes, rather than the specific East Asian selective sweep tied to EDAR 370A. This is a genuinely important point because it shows that hooded eyes are not the product of one single evolutionary event experienced by one population. They are instead the visible result of several different, sometimes entirely independent, genetic pathways, each shaped by its own regional evolutionary pressures, converging on a broadly similar visual outcome. Nature, it turns out, has more than one way to produce the same general appearance, using entirely different genetic tools depending on which population and which ancestral environment you are looking at. This is a useful reminder anytime you hear a broad claim about which group of people has a certain trait. Human variation rarely respects the neat boundaries we like to draw around race and ethnicity, and a feature as visually noticeable as hooded eyes is a perfect example of how much overlap and complexity exists underneath the surface once you actually look at the underlying biology. There is one more layer to this story that deserves attention because it explains why two people with very similar genetic backgrounds can still end up with noticeably different eyelids as they age. And that layer is epigenetics. Epigenetics refers to changes in how genes are expressed, meaning how actively they are used by the body, without any actual change to the underlying DNA sequence itself. Environmental and lifestyle factors, including sun exposure, smoking habits, overall diet quality, and chronic stress, can all influence epigenetic activity related to skin health and collagen production over the course of a lifetime. This means that identical twins, who share essentially the same genetic code, can still end up with visibly different degrees of eyelid hooding later in life, depending on the different environmental exposures and lifestyle choices each twin experiences. One twin who spends decades in intense sun exposure without protection may develop more pronounced sagging and hooding than a genetically identical sibling who lives a different lifestyle, even though both started with the exact same DNA blueprint for their eyelid structure. This is a crucial point because it means genetics sets the underlying structural foundation and the general tendency, but it does not lock in every detail of how your eyes will look for the rest of your life. Environment and time still have a say in the final result. Speaking of time, it is worth drawing a clear line between the inherited genetic hooded eye that some people are born with and a very different process that can create a similar appearance later in life called dermatocalasis. This is an important distinction because a lot of online confusion comes from mixing these two things together as though they are the same phenomenon. True genetic hooding is a structural feature present from birth, visible even in childhood, caused by the underlying inherited shape of the brow, the eye socket, and the eyelid skin itself. Dermatocalasis, on the other hand, is an acquired condition that develops gradually as people age, caused by the natural loss of skin elasticity and collagen that comes with the passage of time. As the skin's structural support diminishes with age, the skin from the brow area can begin to sag and hang down over the upper eyelid, creating a hooded appearance that was not necessarily present earlier in life. Related to this, but still distinct, is a condition called ptosis, which refers specifically to the drooping of the upper eyelid margin itself, often caused by weakness in the levator muscle, the muscle responsible for lifting the eyelid. Someone can have a hooded appearance for any one of these three reasons: inherited genetic structure, age-related skin sagging or muscular weakness, and sometimes for a combination of more than one at the same time, which is part of why the topic is more medically complex than it first appears. This raises a natural question. If hooded eyes are written into your DNA this deeply, can you actually find the evidence sitting in your own genetic code today? In a technical sense, yes and no. Consumer DNA testing services, the kind that analyze saliva samples and report back on ancestry and traits, have become enormously popular over the past decade, and some of them do include eyelid or eye shape predictions among their trait reports. These predictions are usually built from published GWAS data, drawing on the same kinds of genetic markers researchers have identified in population studies. But it is worth approaching these particular predictions with a healthy dose of skepticism. Because eyelid structure is polygenic, shaped by dozens of small effect genes working together rather than one dominant marker, consumer trait predictions for something like hooded eyes tend to be far less reliable than predictions for simpler traits like eye color or earwax type, which are governed by a much smaller number of genes with larger individual effects. A DNA test might flag a handful of relevant variants, but it is unlikely to capture the full complexity of the genetic architecture involved, and it certainly cannot account for the epigenetic and environmental factors layered on top of your underlying genetic blueprint. In other words, the technology to trace this story in a research setting is real and well established, but the technology to translate that research into a precise, personal, 100% accurate prediction for any single individual is still catching up. The bigger picture, the population-level story of ancient migration, selection, and drift, is on far more solid scientific footing than any individual consumer report claiming to explain your specific eyelids down to the last detail. For families, this genetic story helps explain patterns that many people notice without ever fully understanding why. If you trace your family tree back a few generations, you may notice certain eye shapes repeating themselves across relatives, sometimes skipping a generation entirely before reappearing in a grandchild. Twin studies provide some of the strongest evidence supporting just how heritable these features truly are. Identical twins, who share virtually all of their DNA, tend to have remarkably similar eye shapes compared to fraternal twins or regular siblings, who share on average only about half of their genetic material. This kind of comparison is one of the classic tools scientists use to measure how strongly heredity, rather than environment alone, shapes a physical trait. And the pattern holds strongly for eyelid structure, reinforcing the conclusion that while environment and aging play a role in the final appearance, the underlying architecture is deeply written into your DNA, passed down from parent to child across generations, sometimes traceable in its broad strokes back tens of thousands of years to ancient populations moving across an ice age landscape none of us will ever see. So the next time someone tells you that hooded eyes are simply a matter of ethnicity, or purely a sign of aging, or some kind of accident of birth with no deeper explanation, you now know the fuller and far more interesting truth. Your eyelids carry a story written in a genetic code shaped by dozens of interacting genes by an ancient variant that arose in central China 30,000 years ago and swept through a population under real evolutionary pressure, by debates among scientists over selection versus random genetic drift, by competing theories about cold, snow glare, and dust that still are not fully resolved, and by the ongoing influence of your own environment and lifestyle layered on top of all of it. Hooded eyes are not one simple thing with one simple cause. They are a living record of deep human history, written in a language your own DNA has been speaking since long before written history began, long before anyone had a name for genetics, and long before anyone standing in front of a mirror, in any century, in any corner of the world, ever paused to wonder exactly where their eyes truly came from.